What's up, everyone? Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota and Danny Abdel-Jabbar. What's up, brother?
Chilling, man, as per usual, and happy Halloween to you, brother.
Happy Halloween. Yeah, this should be released on Sunday. So we're recording this podcast on Thursday, the 28th. So this should be released on Sunday, Halloween. And Danny, what are you going to be for Halloween? Because I know you take this very seriously.
Yeah, man, I'm the self-proclaimed king of Halloween. I spend way too much money on Halloween costumes and shit like that. This year, I'll be going as the devil. Sounds pretty basic, but I've got this ridiculous mask that's got this giant row of teeth. I'll show you later. But it kind of looks like... you ever watch Attack on Titan, the anime? Or at least familiar with it?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Right. It looks like one of those creatures.
Right, like one of those fucking giant things, like a really big mouth with like huge teeth and shit, you know?
Yeah.
I think that, but like the devil, and it's nuts. And I got this super dope, like red, like pimp suit kind of, right? And for my girlfriend, she's always my prop for Halloween. She's going as an angel. And,
how misogynistic are you? She's your prop?
Yeah, only on Halloween.
How dare you call her a prop?
She accentuates my costume. Well, she's going as an angel this year, and
what are you, in a Taliban? Sorry, she's going as an angel, and she's going to counter your devil.
That's right, and I didn't want it to be basic, so I actually went to the hardware store and picked up like a bunch of random shit. So like PVC pipe, like some boards and shit, and I'm constructing these giant fucking wings, like talking about like 8-foot wingspan wings that I made out of like this PVC and stuff like that. I got this fabric that we're gonna put on it, and like I've got probably like 2,000 feathers, and we're going through the process of like gluing all these fucking feathers onto the thing. So if you're on Patreon, I'll send you guys a picture when it's done so you can see it. But it's this is gonna be a good one, and I needed to make up for last year because last year, you know, Halloween was canceled basically because of fucking COVID. But you'll see me marching in the parade. Hopefully I get on TV.
Wait, last year you spent like $1,000 on your Halloween costume.
No, the year before that. The year before that.
That was 2 years before? Oh man,
yeah,
I'm losing track.
Because last year was COVID. I recycled that costume for last year because I didn't feel it was appropriate for me to spend a bunch of money on a Halloween costume when I've already done that. And you know, the whole point of it, for me at least, is like I like going out into the city, and I like walking in the parade, and I like, you know, all the random people that stop me to take pictures, and like I probably end up on like thousands of people's Instagrams, and I don't even know. And that's just like fun for me. Like I like to be seen, you know, and that's why I do this. It's like a self-gratifying kind of thing, but it's only once a year. So,
do you cosplay?
No, I don't cosplay. I'm not that big a nerd. Just Halloween.
You should LARP.
Fuck LARPing.
You're honestly, LARPing sound. Have you ever witnessed LARPing? Like,
yes,
you've probably seen LARPers.
In college, there was like a whole LARPing group, and they would go out into the field and like just beat the shit out of each other with like these foam boppers. It was hilarious.
LARPers, I see them all. Well, I used to see them when I lived up in the Upper East Side. LARPers in Central Park all the time. They had some type of meetup group where they were there like on the dot, like every Saturday or Sunday. I forget which day it was, but they were always there. And I used to just sit down, watch, and I used to envy them. I used to like, man, I wish I could do this. I wish I could mentally and physically like walk out, dress like a 11-year-old at a birthday party.
Probably just like a knockoff medieval times character, you know?
Yeah. And just be at perfect ease and have a blast. Like, I have such jealousy and envy for people who do that. And I'm not even trying to be like a dick right now and trying to be like, oh, nah, nerd. Like, I really do wish I could do that because it really looks like a lot of fun to do that. Just to like,
hey man, I mean, that's kind of the reason why I like Halloween so much, because it's like the one day a year where you have an excuse to wear whatever the fuck you want and have a good time, and everyone's doing it. So, you know, everyone's having a good time, and like there's such great, you know, conversations that get started, especially if you like pick something that's like super weird or obscure and you're like, hey, what are you? And then boom, immediate conversation starter. I really like Halloween for that reason, because it gives you like the in to be able to express yourself in that way. And Henry, maybe you should take Halloween a little bit more seriously. You can capture a little bit of that jealousy that you have of those LARPers and like channel that into a day where you have like kind of less social pressure or less social anxiety about it, because everybody's doing something weird on Halloween.
This Halloween, I'm already booked. I have my engagement photos.
Are you going to be dressed up like something?
Yeah, we're going to be Dorothy and the Tin Man.
Seriously?
I'm going to be Dorothy. No. Dorothy. I suggested that, though. Dorothy and the Scarecrow or the Tin Man? Do I have no heart or do I have no brain?
Brain.
Yeah, that's probably more accurate. I'll be that's the Scarecrow, right? I got the...
Yeah,
I got my characters right, my Wizard of Oz characters. Okay,
I think so,
let's
yeah.
enough of this shit. Let's get to the episode. Mm-hmm. Sorry, you got to hear that, everyone. Hopefully now you're nice and warmed up for this show. That's why we do this.
Ready
we have
for
a little banter session for a couple minutes, because it warms us up so we can talk about this stuff a little bit less uptight. But not yesterday.
Yeah.
Last week, we had a great conversation with Joseph Solis Mullen. I got Solis right this time. And we had a really good conversation about China, Taiwan, and Joseph came on and he compared it, in a potential war with China over Taiwan with the Falklands War, which was a very interesting comparison. And I encourage everyone to listen to that episode if you haven't yet. Now, something that came up, and we all agreed this would be something interesting to expand upon, was hypersonic missiles. Because hypersonic missiles has been probably one of the number one topics in national security news. If you just type in hypersonic, like there's the articles. The Pentagon is releasing statements on hypersonic missiles. There was today is Thursday. There was a big Wall Street Journal article. There was a big New York Times article on hypersonic missiles. And it's becoming the rage right now to talk about this. And something that we wish we went over a little bit more is what exactly is a hypersonic missile and what this really means for the world, whether that be good or bad or whatever, this bunch of hype. Because I'm really not that sure about it. I'm not really the tech guy of this, but I definitely have my suspicions that this could be a buzzword to, AKA be used to increase defense spending. And we found this guy. Why don't you take it from here and dumb this down as much as possible so we can just start on some super basic stuff. So, what are hypersonic missiles, or where do you start when explaining this?
Yep, and I think you're just about to introduce kind of the source material that we got from this, and I think that's important because I want to give him credit. That's Dr. Cameron Tracy, and he was he is with the Union of Concerned Scientists, who does research on things like hypersonic missiles and nuclear materials. We'll try and link out to that if you want to watch it. Heads up, he does a good job at explaining a lot of this shit, but it's also kind of boring if you're not super nerd like me. And I kind of want to bite off a lot of what he's doing, but just dumb it down, as you said, a lot. And I'll just start with just talking about missiles generally speaking, because I think it's good context for when we talk about hypersonic missiles specifically. Missiles are basically just airborne vehicles that deliver a warhead, something explosive, to a target that's far away, right? And you can deliver this missile. You can shoot it off in a bunch of different ways. So you can shoot it from a sub, you can shoot it from a ship, you could shoot it from trucks, you could shoot them from silos. We got a bunch of silos, or you can shoot them from airplanes.
You can shoot them from everywhere.
You can shoot them out your ass if you want. I'm sure they're probably developing that. So there are generally two types of missiles, right? And maybe three, really. There are cruise missiles. Now, cruise missiles are They have like powered flight, meaning they are constantly moving and they're constantly burning. But they're pretty slow and they're shorter ranged. You can think of them like an unmanned airplane, right? It's just like a thing that flies and it's got a little rocket and it's like, the rocket keeps going until it hits the target, right? That's a cruise missile. Now, the other big one is a ballistic missile, right? And these are unpowered devices, or at least after the rocket burns out, right? So they're pretty fast. They're very long range. You can think of them as like super similar to like a space launch vehicle, right? Or like SpaceX, you see the giant rocket launcher and it flies up into the space and shit. Works pretty much exactly the same way. And then the third one would be the topic of today, which is hypersonic missiles, and I'll talk more about that later, though.
And wait, can you hit ballistic missile a little bit more, just a little bit more detail? So a ballistic missile, it's going up into space, and then it's using gravity to get to a target faster.
That's right. So basically, and I'll talk more specifically about this. And
a good reference is if you see those shooting contests, like when the guys are shooting in a long distance and they're, they have their ballistics and they're trying to measure.
Right. They got to like aim higher, kind of, right?
Yeah.
It's more, a ballistic missile is more akin to like shooting an arrow, right? So you basically, you got the bow and you got the arrow attached to it, right? And you kind of let it loose and then it just flies in this arc pattern, right? That's how ballistic missiles work, right? Except instead of an arrow, it's a fucking missile. It's like a rocket, right? But I'll get into more detail about that in a little bit because it's amazing.
It's amazing the upgrades of technology we've made. This is something else that we spoke about last episode. Just the way that we have enhanced our technology to kill each other. Like we went from arrows to
hypersonic
ballistic missiles.
Yeah.
In 800 years?
Yeah, probably shorter.
700 years? When did we start predominantly using guns on the battlefield? 1500s?
I mean, I wouldn't say predominantly, but at the very least, that's when it started. Yeah.
Yeah. But
because we still had like fucking cavalry and shit up to.
It's not that much time, too. It's really not that much time to think when you really just think about it. Like, I mean, you could probably find a family tree and trace your roots back down there if you had somebody in your family who was like super into that stuff. Like, it wouldn't be that many generations. It would be a lot of generations, but it'd be less than you think.
But you're generally right. It's a big stretch from like arrows to hypersonic missiles.
Well, if you just reverse it though, like 600 years before, the year 1300 and the year 800. Mm-hmm. Or am I doing my math wrong? 700, excuse me. Mm-hmm. I mean, technology really wasn't that. I mean, technology was different, but it wasn't that different.
Nope.
They're still basically using the same weapons. Mm-hmm. I mean, they've been still using the same basic weapons since, for a couple thousand years.
Yep.
Pointy shit. Pointy shit that you put
increasingly
in somebody else's
pointy
body
shit.
Until they bleed to death.
Right.
Or blunt things that you can smash someone's brains out with. Those are the two primary weapons.
Right.
And
pointy
now,
shit and blunt shit. Mm-hmm.
Warheads, fire bombs
right.
that explode and kill everyone within, I mean, I guess you can really pick and choose what mile radius depending on the warhead.
Right.
But I don't know. I think it's an interesting observation to really take in the level of enhancements and weapons technologies that we've made over the past, 700 years. But yeah, get back to the hypersonic missiles now.
Sure. So I know we touched on this last episode, but just for the newcomers, hypersonic, the word, is just like a loose grouping of the unit of measure of speed based on how many times the speed of sound an object is going. Right. So the word in hypersonic, sonic, refers to sound. So hypersonic implies a faster than the speed of sound. A lot faster, actually. And hypersonic is currently the fastest grouping of speed we have based on the speed of sound. So the speed of sound is 767 miles per hour. That's for, the metric folks out there, that's 1,234 kilometers an hour. That means nothing to me. For context, speed of sound is New York to London. So that's 3,459 miles apart in like 4.5 hours. So that's faster than a typical flight, but pretty slow for our conversation. We'll find out. Mm-hmm.
So supersonic is when Sonic you get all the Chaos Emeralds and Sonic turns yellow and is able to like fly and move really fast and is invincible, right?
No, that's not.
What is that? That's hypersonic?
No, it's neither. So let me pull it back a bit. So you've got a couple of different categories of these like Sonic, and I don't mean the Sega Sonic, of course. So you've got subsonic, and that's below the speed of sound. So this is like commercial airplanes, right? Think like a typical 747. They go about Mach 0.86, right? So less than a Mach, not even 1 Mach. And then you have supersonic, right? So this is the middle one. So that's above the speed of sound also. And examples of this are like that supersonic commercial plane. You remember the Concorde?
Yes, I do.
Cool. Well, that one goes Mach 2. And that one can make the trip between New York City and London in like 3 hours. Under 3 hours, actually. So it's a pretty nice upgrade over commercial airlines, but it sucks that they discontinued those planes. And then finally, the last bit, which is the one that we're talking about today, it's hypersonic, right? So you go subsonic, supersonic, hypersonic. And hypersonic generally starts at like Mach 5 or 5 times the speed of sound. Examples here are like experimental planes, things like the U.S. Air Force tested this one plane called the X-15. That thing goes Mach 6.7. So an X-15, to continue this example, if it was going at Mach 6.7 continuously from New York to London, it would take less than 45 minutes. So it's super fast, right? But it definitely wouldn't make it that far because those things have only been able to sustain that speed for like, I don't know, 300 miles or something like that.
So here's the thing. With hypersonic, it seems like a new term, but I swear I've heard the word. I mean, I've heard about hypersonic missiles prior, but it just seems like this is like the way that's being portrayed in the media is that this is like some new secret weapon that's been unleashed on the world and we're about to be destroyed. Like we're about, like China has access to hypersonic missiles and we are doomed. But this isn't like a new thing, right? Like other countries have developed hypersonic weapons, right?
Right.
Like, am I crazy?
So no, you've got that right. I mean, it's hypersonic, generally speaking, has been around for a long time, right? Things that go hypersonic have been around for a long, long time. So one good example is, the earliest example is the Nazi V-2 rocket, right? And that was honestly the first modern missile that was developed. And that traveled at Mach 4.8, so just shy of hypersonic, but not by much. And this was way back in the 40s, right? And all of our current intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that the US and Russia and China and the like all have, they all go like Mach 20 when they're being powered by that rocket booster. So extremely fast, right? So as it relates to hypersonic missiles, we're not talking about some breakthrough in a speed of delivery, right? But there are some emerging missile technologies that are new that are traveling at hypersonic speeds to hit their targets. And it's a lot like the one that China tested last week, right? So this would be a new technology that just happens to be going hypersonic.
So I guess here's the real question then. So why is everyone saying that this new technology that China has is actually that China's beating the United States in this technology?
That's a loaded question, and I think it would take some time to unpack that. Maybe for now, let's just start with some basics, right? So what's new and different about these hypersonic missiles, like the one that China recently tested, is the trajectories that they follow. In other words, the path that they go from launch to target, right? So to highlight this, I can tell you a little bit about the differences between ICBMs and these new hypersonic missiles that are being tested by China. So an ICBM, and we were talking about this a little bit earlier, right? It takes a pretty basic arc path to hit its target. So it goes from, it's launched from the launch site. It's usually like a launching pad, and it goes way up into outer space in the general direction of its target, right? Like pointing in that direction. Like eventually, when it gets to the tippy top point, it runs out of fuel, and they ditch the booster, kind of like with the space shuttles, right? You see, and they're going up, and they get to a certain point, they kind of like kick the boosters off, right? At this point, we only have the warhead, like just the tip, right? And it's going pretty fast already through space, but it's just kind of coasting to its target, right? And then it uses gravity to basically just fall back to Earth to hit its target. And how we get it to like hit is just we use math and physics to get good with the aim.
So, and by the way, we did an entire episode on ICBMs. Do you live near a nuclear sponge? That's the episode. So if you're interested in that, we actually cover that for like an hour and a half or so.
That's right.
But here's the thing. I've read that hypersonic missiles, they don't actually fly the same path as ICBMs, which makes them harder to defend against.
Well, you're right about the path part, but for hypersonic missiles, we actually have to talk about what kind of hypersonic missile, because there's at least 2 types, maybe 3. And this is actually the part that tripped me up on our last episode when we spoke briefly about this. I'll make a correction on what I said later, but the 2 types of hypersonic missiles that we could be talking about are boost glide missiles and air-breathing or scramjet hypersonic missiles. So boost glide missiles, these can be launched in a few different ways, but most commonly they're launched just like an ICBM, right? So like an ICBM, they start off, with like a rocket that they're attached to, right? And they get shot up into the sky and into space, just like an ICBM. And then they ditch the rocket booster just like an ICBM. The difference here is rather than staying in that giant arc pattern, they pretty much immediately dip back into the atmosphere. And the hypersonic boost glide missile stops accelerating once the booster is kicked out. That's the boost part of boost glide. And so the difference though is in the way they go up to space. They just break into space and just immediately come back into the atmosphere. And that's where that glide part comes in that boost glide. So it then glides through the atmosphere at a hypersonic speed to its target. So think of like how a paper airplane works, right? But instead of like your hand boosting the paper airplane, it's a rocket. And of course, instead of a paper airplane, it's a freaking cruise missile. And it's way faster too, right? So basically, we have a rocket, makes it go super fast, and then for the rest of the trip, it's basically like a paper airplane, and it just glides through the air, but like super fast. Now, the second type that I was talking about is a air-breathing or a scramjet hypersonic missile, and these can also be launched like a rocket, like an ICBM could, but more commonly, they've been tested and launched while attached to an airplane, right? And it has its own little booster rocket, which brings it up to a hypersonic speed, and then it detaches, right? And then the warhead itself has an air-breathing engine. Basically, it uses the force of the air that's moving against it at that hypersonic speed, and it mixes it up with some fuel, and that creates its own thrust. So best way I can think of this is like a sports car, right? So those little vents in the hood of these sports cars, they're called hood scoops. Right. Well, so the functional ones, what they do is they're used to take in more air, and they use that air and they combine it with fuel to make the engine go faster. So same idea with these air-breathing hypersonic cruise missiles. But the big difference here is that with this type of missile, it stays in the atmosphere for most, if not all, of its trip. And it's also stepping on the gas continuously throughout its flight. And this is very different from the boost glide ones and the ICBMs, which basically only rely on that initial booster rocket to get it up to speed, and then they slow down over time. Some other variations of this that I won't get into too much detail are like Wave Rider missiles. which, like the name implies, it basically rides the shock wave that's created by going above the speed of sound, and they kind of skip through the atmosphere. Like think of like skipping a stone across the water, but instead of the water, it's the air, right? Do you think you have a good grasp on the different types of these missiles now, or?
Well, yeah, this is probably a good litmus test because let's see if I can get this right. So there's like the paper airplane. So there's the hypersonic boost glide missile.
That's right.
That's the one that accelerates and then it glides and it hits a target, right? Like so.
Right. That's right.
And then the other one that you said, what ramjet sonic missile? Is that what it's called?
Scramjet. Yeah, scramjet.
Scramjet. So that
or air breathing. That's another way.
Or air breathing. Okay, so that just continues to accelerate to the target. Am I getting that correctly, or that like the basic gist?
That's right. I mean, it has a terminal velocity. Like it doesn't keep going faster and faster and faster, but it'll maintain a constant speed. Right.
Gotcha. All right. So are those like the need to know things about the differences between the two?
That's right.
All right. Good. I picked that up. I can't believe it. I've been reading a lot about how these hypersonic missiles are really amazing, and China is beating us. That's the narrative that we hear, that China is beating us in the development of hypersonic missiles, and it's in every single major news outlet. Wall Street Journals,
right?
Wall Street Journals. I don't know why I call them Wall Street Journals. The Wall Street Journal. New York Times. I saw something in the Washington Post about this. It's all
literally
over.
Everywhere.
It's literally everywhere, and it's all about China's beating us in a hypersonic missile. And the main thing that they talk about is that they emphasize the hyper. So they say it's faster than anything that we've ever made, and it's going to be impossible to stop. And I think you even said in our last episode. That's the case, right? I brought that up last episode.
That's right.
So, I mean, what is the deal with that? Like, is this really something that's faster than the current missiles that are in service?
Well, that part is kind of complicated, and I definitely got that part wrong last time. But in the case of boost glide hypersonic missile, the answer appears to be a clear no. And I'll go back to the kind of source material here.
So these are the paper airplane ones, all right? We'll just
the paper airplane
the one
ones.
The paper airplane ones. So imagine a paper airplane.
Right. So the paper airplane ones are not at all, not even close to as fast. So going back to the talk that I watched here, Dr. Tracy, he goes into a lot of detail about it, and I just want to go ahead and point out some of the interesting findings that he brings up. So I'll just come out and say them now, and we can talk about why later. So here's a few things that he found out. The paper airplanes are slower than ICBMs. The paper airplanes are not invisible. The paper airplanes can be taken out with existing defenses. The paper airplanes are expensive. And the paper airplanes are basically just a money grab for the Defense Department and its contractors. And that's the conclusions that he comes to.
Okay, so... And I watched this video too, and I think this went more over my head than yours, obviously. I'm having trouble understanding how are these hypersonic missiles slower than the ICBMs today?
So surprisingly, the reason is actually really easy to follow. The mistake everyone's making about these weapons, myself included, honestly, is focusing super hard on that word hypersonic. Right, so you hear hypersonic, and you're like, "Oh, right."
I hear the word hyper, and I'm like,
fast. Hyper is better than super, so it must be super fast, right? No,
hyper is in the case of these describe as like an annoying kid in school. Oh, he's hyper. He's so hyper.
That was before we understood what
That's what I was called.
ADHD was, right?
He's a hyper. Gotta put him on Ritalin.
Just super hyper. Yeah, so for these paper airplanes, like ICBMs, they only really travel at that super fast speed for the boost phase. That's the part when they're still attached to the rocket, right? So once that rocket is ejected, that warhead no longer accelerates, and it actually slows down over time as it passes through the atmosphere.
Okay. I think I get it, but I read that because hypersonic missiles don't travel as high as ICBMs, they don't have to make as long as a trip, which is why they get to the target faster.
So that's a good point, and that's the going narrative, but it's just a narrative, and it's wrong. So the first thing that the narrative ignores is air resistance. For boost glide hypersonic missiles, for these paper airplanes, the warhead stays in the atmosphere much longer than the ICBMs do. So ICBM warheads are in the atmosphere for like 5 minutes tops. And the first part of it is during that boost phase when it's traveling on the way up. And then the other part of it is when they're in that free fall stage on the way down. But for the majority of the ICBM trip, it's in space where there's no air resistance or drag. That's what it's called, right? And so for these paper airplane ones, the boost glide ones, they actually slow down considerably during the flight because it spends the majority of the time in the atmosphere. So while it's true that the total distance that the hypersonic missile travels is less than the distance that an ICBM would be traveling because they go much, much higher, the fact that it's hitting so much drag during the flight actually makes it hit its target later than an ICBM would because it's slowing down over time. So Dr. Perry actually goes on and on and on and on about the math behind it. I'm not going to bore you with it. Either take my word for it or go watch the video, right? But to highlight this a bit more, he points out this really interesting testimony, and I want to just like kind of read it to you. So there's this guy, General Hyten. He's the Stratcom commander, and in 2019 he testified to the Senate Arms Service Committee about like hypersonic weapons. And Senator Shaheen, who was doing the questioning at the time, he asked the question, would we have any sense about how much time from the point at which those weapons might be launched until when they might land in the United States? To which General Hyten responds, it's a shorter period of time. The ballistic missile is roughly 30 minutes. A hypersonic weapon, depending on the design, could be half of that, depending on where it was launched from, the platform. Okay, so he's implying here, General Hyten, is implying that the hypersonic missile is going to reach its target sooner than an ICBM. But notice how he did that implication, right? Notice how he implied it. The one thing he said was, depending on where it was launched from. Right? And if we go back to the math...
So what does he really mean by depending on where it's launched from? It could just mean anything.
So Dr. Perry actually did the math around it, right? And clearly physics says if you launch those two weapons from the same place, the ICBM is going to get there faster because it's encountering way less drag through the air. But if you're clever about it and you say depending on where it was launched from, what he's really meaning to say here is that if you launched a hypersonic missile from Ireland to the United States instead of like Moscow, then yeah, it's going to get to the target faster than an ICBM would if it was launched from Moscow because it started closer. That's literally the only way physics is going to allow it to get there faster, is if you put it closer. So he's being tricky with his words here. He's saying depending on where it was launched from. Here's another way he was being tricky. He says depending on the design, right? So here he might be referring to that air-breathing scramjet, right? The sports car version, right? And Dr. Perry didn't actually cover scramjet or air-breathing hypersonic missiles in his talk. And that's kind of where I have some doubts about all of his conclusions, especially on the drag issue, because literally air-breathing scramjets rely on that air to power the missile and make it keep going faster. But here's the thing. With all the evidence that we have, especially about this China test, right? China tested a paper airplane, not a air-breathing scramjet, which is probably why Dr. Perry spent way more time talking about the paper airplanes. And also, nobody's ever been able to implement a scramjet missile in a practical way yet for more than like a couple hundred miles. And that basically just a few hundred miles basically puts us out of range of danger when we're talking about China. Taiwan is totally fucked though.
All right, so let's just do a quick recap. So the missile that China tested was the airplane one that glides.
Paper airplane.
The paper
That's
airplane. Right. All right. So the one that accelerates and then glides to its target. Not the scramjet, the sports car one that accelerates constantly to its target. And the paper airplane is actually slower than what we have right now.
Well, the paper airplane is slower than an ICBM, yeah.
Okay,
it won't hit its right. It won't, because of physics, it won't hit its target faster than a ICBM. It just won't. You can't break physics, And the thing is that General Hyten here used some, in my opinion, probably intentionally misleading language when he was talking to the Senate Arms Committee, because he knew that the media is going to pick it up, and that's why we're all misled into thinking that these new, hypersonic boost glide missiles are somehow faster than ICBMs, and they aren't. They just aren't.
All right, so they're slower, but you said they aren't invincible or invisible, right? So doesn't flying lower make the missile harder to detect on radar?
Not actually. Not exactly, at least. So there's this claim that it's harder to detect because, it's flying lower, like you said, right? And that's actually more about the path that it flies and less about whether or not we can see it. So maybe for some basic ground radar, it might be harder to detect because it flies at an irregular path that's lower. In other words, because of the curvature of the Earth, and yes, the Earth is round, not flat.
Wait,
they won't
sure
be able to see it. I'm pretty sure.
Prove it.
I think we've done this once before, dude. I don't want to rehash that. That was like 2 years ago or something like that. Anyway, because of the curvature of the Earth, if it's flying low, right, it would be, the radar wouldn't pick it up very far away. Unlike an ICBM, which flies super, super high, right? So you'd be able to see it earlier on by ground radar. But we're still going to see it because that's not how we track ICBMs. We track ICBMs with satellites, right? And see, we have all these satellites in space, and they've been around forever, and they're constantly looking for signs of a missile launch, like at least since the Cold War, right? And how they do this is by detecting infrared light. And that infrared light is put out by the heat that comes from those rocket boosters, right? Like I said, we've had this for a really long time, and we've spent a lot of time and money into developing this technology. And this is how we know about North Korea's war with Atlantis, right? We see them launch the rocket, and we can calculate its path, and we know that they're going to hit the ocean, right? And that's why we don't freak out every time they, launch a rocket. Remember, boost glide missiles also use rockets. So we're going to see those also on the way up.
Aren't we going to be able to predict their path because they don't fly like ICBMs, though, right?
No, also no. So it's true that the path is different and irregular, and it would be harder to calculate its path because it's going through the atmosphere instead of that like really clearly defined arcing pattern. But remember the drag issue, right? So how in movies when an asteroid, it's like coming crashing down into Earth, right? And it goes into the atmosphere, or like when a spaceship is like re-entering into the atmosphere and you see that there's all like that fire and shit that's like all around the asteroid or all around the spaceship.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
I know
here?
what you're talking about.
Cool. So that's actually air heating up around the object as it passes around it, right? Because the thing is moving so damn fast, and the air is, has friction against the thing, and then it causes it to basically light on fire. The air is on fire, right? Well, same thing happens to that boost glide vehicle, the paper airplane, as it's flying through the air. Remember, it's going 5 times the speed of sound. It's pretty fast. So it is constantly going to be enveloped in this plume of heat. and that heat is going to give off a lot of infrared light. So that infrared light is not nearly as bright as the light that we would see from a booster rocket, but that light is still well bright enough for us to see it from those satellites. And this is another one of those points that Dr. Tracy debunks with a bunch of math, and I'm not going to go into it, but just put it this way. The thing's moving, if it moves super fast, it's going to encounter drag, and if it encounters drag, it's going to create heat and infrared light. And if it does that, we're going to be able to see it with our satellites, so it's not invisible. And therefore, we can predict its path, or at least we can do a pretty good job.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, according to, I guess, the evidence that or the scientific projections and mathematical projections of this, so it's not It's not going to be faster, or it's not faster. It's not undetectable. It's not invisible.
That's right.
But I read that because it's like a mini plane, that it can avoid missile defenses by just flying out of the way. So is that also something that was either addressed by Dr. Tracy, or I don't know, what is that? What is that? Like, is that true? Is there any truth to that? The fact that
so that part is kind of true, right? So ICBMs are basically like, I said this before, right? It's like shooting an arrow. Once you let one go, there's no directing it after the fact, right? And because of this, we can use the information that we get from satellites to know with pretty good, accuracy where that ICBM is and where it's going to go. So we've built up a bunch of missile defense systems to try and combat that by basically shooting another missile at that missile. Think of like Iron Dome, in Israel, or Patriot missile defense systems, or S-400s, right? That's what we do. We can see where they're going. We generally know where they're going to go. So our idea is we're just going to shoot another missile at it because we know where it's going to be, right? And we do a pretty good job. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty good. And like General Hyten said, we've got at least 30 minutes to stop them, right? So it's more than enough time for us to figure shit out. Crunch all the numbers, do the math, and, shoot our own missile at it. But with these new hypersonic missiles, it's a little different. Since they are like mini planes, you can steer them, right? And this could potentially be done remotely by a person, like flying a drone, or it could be done automatically by computers. Now, I haven't found anything definitive on how effective these things are at avoiding incoming anti-air missile defenses. But right now, it's kind of hard to imagine that we couldn't figure out how to shoot them out of the sky, even if they can steer themselves. Especially these boost-glide missiles, they're definitely going to be easier to hit than scramjet or air-breathing ones, because if you steer them, like, remember, this is a paper airplane, if it veers off the original path that it was going on, it's going to encounter more drag and it's going to slow down faster, right? So you won't be able to do all crazy kind of maneuvers. It's not going to be like a Sukhoi flying around in the air, like doing backflips and shit, right? It only has but so much momentum to fly through the sky. So it can only really turn so hard, right? Scramjet ones might be a problem, because it has a propulsion system, it won't slow down that much by turning or by doing an evasive maneuver. But it would expend more fuel doing that. And right now that can only really be a problem if we figure out how to get them to go farther than a couple hundred miles. Overall, though, the math suggests that these weapons, very much like the ones that were tested by China recently, are not as dangerous as the media makes them out to be. And this was the mistake I made last episode. And it was that I thought that China's test was a big deal because I got the types of hypersonic missiles mixed up. What I was thinking initially was that China had successfully deployed something like an air-breathing scramjet. But it looks like they didn't do that. They're just doing paper airplanes, right? I'd be a little bit more concerned if they made scramjets that were fucking great, But here's the thing, though. We've been working on hypersonics a lot longer than China, and we're working on the dangerous scramjet kinds too. And there's actually a pretty good Forbes article that I used for some additional research on air-breathing hypersonic missiles. I'm going to read you a quick little quote. So the DARPA press release says key parameters tested were success in launching from an airplane, ignition of the rocket, separation of the spent rocket booster, and successful cruising at high speeds, but not successful on impact on a target. So right now, what that means is that we have prototypes which could sustain Mach 5 plus speeds in the atmosphere. They also talk about how they're small enough to be launched by a plane, and also they're going to be harder but not impossible to detect on radar because they have a super small radar cross-section. Here's another quote. The Hypersonic Attack Cruise Missile, which has already been allocated $190 million in funding in the draft 2022 budget, appears to be a more straightforward operationalized successor to the Hawk, which is another one of these things that we've been working on, that can be carried operationally by both bombers like the B-2 and the B-1 Lancer and fighters like the F-35 or the F-15. So we already passed budget for it. You know, we're going to be spending money on it anyway. We already have the prototypes. They're doing this. We're already doing this. And we're doing the dangerous kinds too. All right, last little bit from that article. DARPA is concerned with developing advanced technologies well ahead of what's immediately practicable. And thus, the Hawk program, incepted in 2014, doesn't seek to create a viable weapon, but rather to refine the prerequisite propulsion and airframe technologies. That leaves important characteristics such as guidance capabilities unelaborated. That is to say, just to sum that up, it probably isn't going to work, right? We're just kind of spending money to fuck around and see what we can create. What new technology can we make just for the sake of making new technology, right? Now, I think it's conceivable that they could be more dangerous and we could be making some stuff, you know, and maybe China actually does work on some scramjets and that, you know, that would be dangerous. But, you know, we have to use science and math to figure out what's the best solutions against those weapons. Everything we know right now, it suggests that it's probably better to just further develop our existing anti-missile defenses, as well as the satellites that we use to track all these things, rather than just kind of focusing on these expensive new toys. And this kind of brings me to the point that Dr. Tracy was trying to make in his talk. And it's that the military-industrial complex, the MIC, they just want us to think that hypersonic missiles are a big threat right now so that they can appropriate more money to develop them. So they do things like intentionally misleading, you know, they put out this intentionally misleading information, like the one that General Hyten did at that Senate Arms Committee hearing, because they knew that the media is going to pick it up and run with it, and then everybody's going to get scared and China-phobic and all this other shit, and it's going to give them, you know, Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon, all these people, it's going to give them an excuse to just get new contracts and make a lot of money for something that it's probably not even going to work. And if it does work, we haven't figured out a practical application for it. And if we have figured out a practical application for it, we have something cheaper that does the same thing, probably just as good, if not better. ICBMs, you know? It's all kind of just it's an MIC thing, you know?
This really reminds me, or doesn't remind me because I didn't live in this day of age. However, this is a very similar story to the missile gap. Have you ever heard about the missile gap?
Totally. Mm-hmm.
Quote unquote, the missile, air quotes, the missile gap.
Yep.
And the missile gap was something that was very big in the 1950s. So basically, this is something that JFK actually campaigned on, was bridging the missile gap between the Soviet Union and the United States. And remember, Kennedy was like a pretty Cold War hardliner.
Yep.
He attacked Eisenhower for being too soft in Southeast Asia. As Eisenhower was finishing up his second term, Democrats portrayed him as, the old man who was falling asleep.
Right.
Basically, the Democrats portrayed Eisenhower like Republicans are portraying Biden right now. It's kind of like old and incompetent.
Soft.
Soft, weak, old and incompetent. Asleep at the wheel. I think that's the term that's been used.
That's a really good comparison, dude. Yeah.
In 1957, there's this sudden crisis that meant doom for Western civilization. And the Soviets, they successfully tested a intercontinental ballistic missile, and allegedly they had way more ICBMs than America. And in a war, the popular consensus among the national security establishment was that the U.S. would be wiped off the face of the earth, if we got into a war due to this missile gap. And the reason, or one of the main reasons why this story was given so much credibility, was because the same year, in 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik into space. So, the Soviets beat us to launching shit in orbit in space.
Yeah, we had serious FOMO back then about that.
So, the Soviet Union, they start to appear as more advanced in just technology in general, and weapons technologies, and just the ability to shoot shit at other people. Just going back to our analogy, or, just the thought experiment, not really a thought experiment, but like when we were talking about how we've advanced so much in technology in just like 700, 800 years. The Soviet Union had our edge, apparently, at this time. Well, it turned out that the missile gap was complete horseshit. It was a very carefully and constructive narrative, and the whole point of the missile gap was designed to increase defense spending. And when Kennedy gets into office, Eisenhower just straight up, he tells him, during his transition meeting, that there is no missile gap. Like,
we ain't got none.
There is no missile gap. Like, who do you think I am? I'm Eisenhower. Like, I'm supreme commander. I was supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force. I bossed other generals around from different countries. I was a 5-star general. Like, you're a fucking punk rich kid.
Right.
So, I mean, that was, there's like a lot of, it's like an interesting meeting if you ever read about the meeting between Eisenhower and JFK during a transition meeting. Like, apparently Eisenhower was like, do you know what it is to be president? And he like showed him all this cool shit about like how, like, look what I can do right here. And like a helicopter come picks him up. So like, this is the power that you got. Here's a football. You can launch a nuke anywhere. It's like a real interesting story. But, Kennedy probably knew that there was no missile gap. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. Maybe, obviously it was just a political ploy. I don't really think he gave too much thought about it until he was actually in the White House and had to deal with these nut jobs himself.
He probably just found something that the American public thought was correct. Like there was this, missile gap fear going around, and Sputnik had just happened, and it was like, all right, well, I'm just going to use this as a way to beat down political opponents, right? This is a weak point. It's just
why wouldn't you? And it's just kind of fun. It's ironic though. I mean, I think it's becoming more accepted among just like the general population that there's a lot more to the Kennedy assassination, and it had something to do with messing around with the wrong people. Either in the military-industrial complex or the CIA or foreign intelligence agencies, and it's interesting. Or all of the, or in the mafia, or all of the above. It's like there's so many people who wanted them dead that it's hard to exactly point. But there are some pretty interesting, and compelling JFK conspiracies.
So not to go too deeply into a rabbit hole, but I've been watching American Horror Story this year. And it's a 2-parter, and the first part is like, I don't know, crackhead vampires, which was weird. But the second part is like aliens, and I'm all big into aliens and shit like that. But
Aliens
it's
killed
like this,
JFK.
yeah, dude. So it's like no spoilers or anything like that.
I wasn't. You
This,
just spoiled it.
well, it's this alternate history, right? And it starts with Eisenhower, and it's like because Eisenhower was around during the Roswell shit, right? And it starts off how like Eisenhower does a deal with the aliens, and this is all in the first episode, right? To like let them abduct human beings. And then it goes through like Eisenhower and like Nixon and like JFK and shit like that. And like the reason that JFK ends up getting shot is because he wanted to out this like meeting, this like deal that we had with the aliens. And they didn't let that happen, right? It's super fascinating. If you don't like American Horror Story, but you do like alternate history shit, I actually think it's worth a watch. Even better if you do like American Horror Story. It's super fun, and it like to play along with your idea of like JFK had a lot of people gunning for him. It might have been aliens too, man. It might have been aliens.
Could have been. I wouldn't rule anything out. That's what Dave Chappelle said, right? No, it was Dave Chappelle's skit. It was a magic bullet. It was an actual magic bullet, and that when he was the black president,
mm-hmm.
and he was talking about Meteor, and he was like this, and he's like, like it was a magic bullet, and then he was like, aliens exist. I'm going with my friend Bibble and these white twins, and we're gonna go colonize another planet. You Chappelle Show fan?
Yeah, man, totally.
Do you remember this skit?
It in years, but. Yeah,
it's a funny. But all right, the missile gap. Back to the missile gap. So basically, it was just conspired by the MIC. So there's an Air Force general at this time named General Curtis Lee May, and him and a couple of Congress critters who were connected to the defense industry. They're the ones who primarily started this rumor, and it starts in a congressional hearing in 1957 that I guess one of the first claims is that in 3 years the Russians would be able to launch a surprise knockout attack on the U.S. and it was because the U.S. was behind Russia and B-52 bombers. So they
just bombers in general
They lobbied the U.S. to increase their B-52 bombers from like 137 to like 1,800. But it was like an extra $4 billion. Increase. Yeah, it was like an extra $4 billion in defense in the defense budget.
Wait, and then money or now money?
In then money, and $4 billion in 1957. So a lot. Now, Eisenhower knew this wasn't really the case, but there were people who in his own administration who were trying to undermine him. And what happened was that Eisenhower's the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Research and Development resigned and said that Eisenhower was withholding money for ballistic missile research and that the Soviet Union was about to develop their own ballistic missile. And, if the Soviet Union got a ballistic missile, then all these European countries would just be like, oh, well, the Soviet Union is going to destroy us all. We better just give power to all our, local communist parties. And that was really like the narrative that was going on in the 1950s, that they were going to get this missile. Europe is gone. All of Europe's going to capitulate. And the communist parties there are going to be so empowered because the Soviet Union's had access to, more firepower, could outgun the United States. And this is where Scoop Jackson comes in. So we've talked about Scoop Jackson, Henry Jackson. He was a Democratic senator from Washington, and he was a mentor for many of the future prominent neoconservatives. So Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl, they both worked for Scoop Jackson as aides. So he was one of the godfathers of neoconservatism. Scoop Jackson. A lot of them stem from like the Cold Warrior Democrats from the 1950s. And the reason why he would attack Eisenhower, it wasn't because Eisenhower was weak. Eisenhower wasn't weak. Eisenhower would threaten to nuke people daily, basically. Eisenhower would just be like, okay, I'll nuke you. I'll nuke you. I'll nuke you. It's like, you got to make people believe that you'll nuke them. He wasn't weak. The reason why, the missile gap was pushed was because he was a Washington, he was a Washington senator, and not Washington State. And Boeing at the time was based out of Seattle before they moved to Chicago. They moved to Chicago like within the past 2 decades, like 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So, he was effectively serving as a lobbyist for Boeing during his political career. And it's also important to note, we like I said just now, Eisenhower's strategic doctrine was massive retaliation. So, massive retaliation is basically like, don't do anything that we don't like or we'll destroy you. Or if you show any sign of aggression, we'll just completely annihilate you. That's it.
Right. It's kind of like North Korea's defense against South Korea is just like, don't try nothing because we've got mad flak guns and artillery pointed at Seoul, and we can hit them in seconds if we want to, and we're going to make it really painful for you.
Well, yeah. Well, what that does is that it eliminates the need for other branches of the military. So
that's right.
At this time, or at least diminishes it. So what was pushed by the Democrats during the election cycle during Eisenhower's second term was flexible response. And flexible response was basically like, you need to be flexible. You can't just eliminate the normal army that we're used to. Like, there's going to be situations where we're going to need to have like pitched war and stuff like that. Like, they did not want to lose.
You can't just rely on the defense spending, right?
Because remember, Eisenhower increased the amount of nuclear warheads in the United States by like 2,000%. It was something like 20,000. I think by the end of his term, there was like 18,000 nuclear warheads in our circulation. It's a lot, which basically says like, all right, we're going to rely on this. Like we're going to rely on.
Don't really need an army when you have
tactically. We don't really need an army when we can destroy you with pushing my button. So that became like something kind of the beat to criticize Eisenhower with, because there was a lot of jobs on the line. But what was really interesting is that Eisenhower commissioned a study on the ability of the U.S. to withstand a nuclear attack and like what to do about it. And the guy who writes this report or who writes the report on this committee is Paul Nitz. And Paul Nitz is, we spoke about this guy a couple of episodes ago when we did our show on the origins of the Cold War. He's the guy who drafted most of the NSC 68, which is basically the blueprint for permanent militarization of after World War II.
Right.
And the report was titled...
we would wind down our militarization after every major war.
Exactly. So, the modern day permanent military state that we live in now started after World War II, because, after the Civil War, after the Spanish-American War, after World War I, the United States would always demilitarize and they would stop.
Everybody would go home.
Defense budget. People would go home and get jobs, and wouldn't be like this career thing. Now, after World War II, there was a permanent arms industry that did not want to go away. So they needed a justification to exist. Well, the NSC 68 is what was the blueprint that outlined, that current really garrison state. That's what Eisenhower called it, garrison state. Now, the report was titled The Deterrence and Survival in the Nuclear Age. And it just made a lot of false claims. So it claimed that the Soviets had 1,500 nuclear weapons, 450 bombers, and 300 submarines pointed at the United States. And it also said the Soviet Union was growing stronger, and but by the 1960s they were gonna just completely pass us in basically everything that we were doing militarily and technology wise. And it recommended that Eisenhower increase the defense budget. It's like it was. I think its recommendation was to increase defense spending by like $40 billion or so, or like 44. I think it was $44 billion over the next 5 years, and it basically repudiated Eisenhower's current new look strategy, and it also advocated for more nuclear weapons, but it also advocated for the conventional forces, to let them enable, to so they can suppress small wars.
Right. For the little ones.
For the little wars. And what it also did was it claimed that the Soviets maintained an army of 175 line divisions, and it was just completely exaggerated. And it just also hinted that they were about to take over Europe. It was just a bunch of pure fantasy. There was no evidence for any of this. In fact, the evidence pointed that this was not true. So the reason why Eisenhower knew all of this was a lie was because the CIA was running U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union and giving him intelligence reports on their different capabilities. Right. And I think the report claimed that the Soviet Union had hundreds of these intercontinental missiles. Guess how many they actually had?
I don't know.
They had
10s?
4.
4?
They had 4. They had 4 of these. They had nothing. All this was complete horse shit. Like, none of this was real. So it was just made, this report was just made up. And it was like the Steele dossier. Like, it was just some Looney Tune fucking report. And then what happens is that someone from the committee leaked it to the Washington Post. So there was an anonymous leaker.
I mean, that's usually how it goes, right?
Yeah. It was most likely Paul Nitz who did it. So, I mean, it could have been anyone, I guess, but I mean, that's the guy people kind of point to who most likely leaked this to the Washington Post.
So they made a bullshit report.
In the Washington Post, they run with it and they're like, "Oh, the U.S. is in grave danger. It's in the gravest danger in human history. Oh no!" And I think this is one of the main reasons why Eisenhower, and I'm not saying Eisenhower was perfect. Like, he certainly increased the likelihood of a nuclear war, I guess, right? Like, just by circulating that many bombs, but he wasn't really interested in, I mean, also the CIA grew under him, and but he wasn't certainly interested in like having a traditional another World War II type war. I mean, he got us out of Korea.
Right.
I don't think he ever planned on having anything like Vietnam or what Vietnam turned into. This is why I think that Eisenhower decided to warn the public about the MIC during his farewell address. Because it's kind of weird, right? The fact that Eisenhower, the main thing that he talks about during his farewell address, or at the very least, the most memorable thing, the thing that everyone remembers, is that he's like, guys, we have created a military-industrial complex. The defense industry is ran by corporate interest, and like, this is how decisions are made.
Right.
It's weird though to see him say that. Like, don't you? I get a little bit of like, man, he really must have seen some shady shit. He must have seen some shit if he decided to blow the whistle before he left office.
That's right. That is right. I mean, kind of going back to the American Horror Story alternate history thing, at the end, he starts to have his second thoughts about that deal that he made with the aliens, and, he's, very uncomfortable with what he created, whether advertently or inadvertently. And I think the same is probably true in real life. He was probably doing what he thought was right during the time, but it kind of spiraled out of control, and now he realized he created a monster. So, in his like last ditch effort, he's trying to warn the public that, hey, this MIC thing, it's not very good. And it's kind of funny how, when you talk about the report about this gap and like how much the Soviet Union had, how they create this bullshit report and then leak it themselves, and the media picks it up, and then everyone goes nuts about it, right? It sounds a lot like what we're hearing now. I feel like they just took a page out of that book right there from the Eisenhower era, and they were just like, all right, well, we're just going to go to the Senate Arms Committee, and we're not going to lie to them. We're just going to like kind of twist words a little bit to make it sound like this is a big deal, right? And then they knew that the media was going to pick it up, and that, and they have, just literally Google hypersonic, just the word hypersonic. That's it. And you're going to get dozens of articles about how we're in imminent danger and we're going to die tomorrow if we don't spend billions of dollars to also create this, and I mean, what does that effectively do? Like, I guess you could say that, mutually assured destruction has worked so far, right? Where we increased our bombs and they increased their bombs, and now we all have more than enough bombs to blow each other up and blow the entire planet to smithereens, so we're not going to go to war, right? Are we really going to use this new technology as just like another mutually assured destruction? Like, do we think that that's going to be effective again? We can already blow each other up a million times over. A faster missile isn't necessarily going to change the game somehow,
I know. It's like we already have so many of them.
Remember
just because a couple of them go faster than the other ones is going to change the game. It's going to just be. It's going to make that big of a difference.
Right. Remember our conversation on the nuclear sponge, right? Where we intentionally put all of these intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear tips on them, literally everywhere, all over the country. Like, you might live near one, right? That's the title of the episode. Is, do you live near a nuclear sponge? And the reason why we do that is because, in the event of like a full scale, war with someone like Russia, or in this case, China, the idea is if you had all your missiles in one place, your enemy is just going to attack that one place and then basically get rid of your ability to retaliate with the same nuclear force, right? So to mitigate this issue, we just put them everywhere. So, okay, maybe you take out New York, maybe you take out Washington, maybe you take out a couple of like missile silos, but we still have thousands of other places where we can shoot off these thousands of other nuclear weapons. So, big fucking deal. You got off a cheap shot, now we're going to blow up the whole fucking planet, right? So same thing with these hypersonic missiles. Just because we don't have them, which is not true, we do, right? But let's just say China is leaps and bounds better than us right now, right? And they have this new cool toy that can fly faster than anything else, and maybe we can't stop it. Do you really think that we're just going to sit down and be like, oh, I guess we lose? No, we're going to fucking bomb the living hell out of them with nukes if they try something, And then we all lose.
It's just outrageous to think that anyone would ever shoot a missile at the United States.
Right?
Maybe Taiwan. Maybe you can fantasize that. Okay.
Right. Taiwan's fucked.
This technology is for only projecting power in the Pacific. Nothing else.
Right.
They're not going to attack the American homeland. They're not going to even attack anything outside of Taiwan. Can you imagine if China attacked Japan or South Korea?
Oh God, no.
They would never in a million years.
Maybe not never, but it would be the dumbest mistake they can ever make. And it very well might be the last mistake they make, too.
Japan doesn't have nuclear weapons, but in a couple of weeks they could.
Yep. I mean, they have plenty of nuclear reactors, and they have plenty of... They can enrich uranium very quickly. And they have all the tech... Dude, they make Gundams. They make giant robots. They can spin up a nuke pretty quickly if they needed to.
I mean, that's a deterrent in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, maybe they don't have nuclear warheads ready to be launched, but they sure as hell can make those in a couple of weeks.
Yep, it wouldn't take long.
So, I mean, I just don't see this threat. I think it's really like we're scrambling for a bad guy. We're scrambling for someone to divert our attention as we withdraw more from our current wars, and China's just perfect. I mean, let's just be real. China is a totalitarian government. They are bad.
Mm-hmm.
They are not an ideal country. But they make the perfect boogeyman. And like, let's just get serious. A war with China would just most likely be the end of humanity. It wouldn't be. It wouldn't be a positive outcome. It wouldn't be like a glorious ending. It would just be the end of human civilization.
Either that or both sides would just agree to stop because they recognize that it would be the end of humanity, We would get nowhere. Nothing would happen.
Here's what Eisenhower said, and maybe we can end it with this unless you want to add something else.
No, that works for me.
This is something from his famous farewell address. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals so that security and liberty may prosper together. So the only way to combat these influences, and if you haven't listened to this speech, I recommend it. I would recommend listening to the full Eisenhower farewell address because he focuses on this. He's basically saying like, hey, you gotta be paying attention to what these animals are doing. Like these guys are just lying constantly, and there's a business interest involved, and there are people making money, and that's why these wars are going on, or that's why there's people who are pushing for wars. By no means am I saying Eisenhower was perfect. I'm just saying that his keen observations at the end and him talking about this has obviously created probably the number one word that people who are against these interventions use to put them in that catch-all phrase, the military-industrial complex. I mean, when I was younger, the MIC almost sounded like a conspiracy theory. I was like, oh, MIC, you must be a nutty, crazy person talking about the MIC. There's no MIC, and then clearly there is. Clearly there's business interest.
It's actually not.
And people making money off this shit.
Yeah.
And not just business interest, but there's also political interest and career interest as well. So, I mean, there's a lot of... listen to our episode on understanding the war industry with Christian Sorensen, who wrote a wonderful book on... an incredible book on it. And we had a really great interview. So I wouldn't use wonderful to describe a book about the military-industrial complex. Doesn't seem right.
It's wonderful.
Wonderful. Okay. Do you have anything else to add?
No, man. I think that's a good place to end.
Okay. All right, guys. Thanks for listening to another episode of Bro History. We really appreciate you guys giving us your attention. If you want to support the show, make sure that you rate and review the podcast. That is number one way to support us. And then you can also join us on Patreon, where you get access to our Slack community. It's a great way to support the show as well. And I guess we'll see you next week.
Peace.
Peace.